Good afternoon and good morning. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you for joining today's presentation on utility business model reform in remote communities. My name is Emily, and I'm an analyst with the Renewables in Remote Communities team at the Pembina Institute. Just a note that if you have any technical difficulties throughout the webinar, please put a note in the chat and we'll be happy to assist you. Today's presentation will be an hour long, with the remaining half hour of today's webinar being scheduled for Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please leave a note in Zoom's Q&A function. I'm presenting today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Chippewa peoples.
And hello, good morning and afternoon, everybody as well. My name is Dave Lovkin. I'm the director of Pembina's Renewables in Remote Communities program. So good to see so many familiar names up on the attendee list. We have been working hard on this research and we're happy and excited to present it today. I myself am presenting and located in the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking people. So specifically on Vancouver Island, live very close and near to Sauk First Nation, Shainu First Nation, Esquimalt, and Songhees Nations. So just wanted to acknowledge the territories that I have the pleasure of living on. Next slide, please, Emily. So to start off, I'm just going to give a few words to set the stage, and then I will pass it over to Emily for the majority of the presentation today. So I believe many of you on the call or on the webinar know about the Pembina Institute, but quickly, we are a nonprofit, national nonprofit organization that works on effectively supporting and advocating for strong policies to support the necessary transition Canada has to go through to reach its international commitments on greenhouse gas emission reductions. So we support that research, or we support that work through research and analysis, convening stakeholder conversations like this, supporting our research analysis and providing credible perspectives on what strong and effective policies look like. We work in a variety of sectors across Canada. We work in transportation, buildings, electricity, the clean economy, and the program that this work is under is supporting Indigenous communities, northern and remote communities to transition off of diesel fuel onto the clean energy transition that they want to see their communities thrive in. Next slide, please. This research that we are presenting today is right now the third piece in a much larger initiative. The first one was back a few years ago, and hopefully I see Dylan Hirma on the webinar today. We wrote a blog back in 2019, just touching on this concept of what the future utility, apologies for the phone, what the future of the electric utility in Canada's remote community looks like. What are the fundamental challenges that remote communities are, or utilities operating in remote communities are facing. Then we did a follow-up blog to that under the Indigenous Off-Diesel Initiative policy series that we have been producing, entitled When Business as Usual is a Barrier to Clean Energy. So again, going a little bit deeper into the way utilities operate. This research has been an undertaking for several months now, and it's now looking at what are some of the solutions, looking at and what utilities that serve remote communities, the utility business model that they operate under, what other opportunities and options are out there to support clean energy transition in remote communities. So this is the next piece. This is what we're presenting today, and there will be more. Next slide, Emily. For many of you that will also be attending our conference, the Pembina's Renewables and Remote Communities Conference in 2022, which is happening next week up in Whitehorse. All of you, hopefully, that are attending there, stay healthy. Can't wait to see you there. And a piece of that conference, we will actually be convening utilities based on this research to actually sit down and talk about a little bit beyond what we're going to get to today. Today is more of a download of information. But at the conference, we will actually want to get together and sit down with utilities and further understand the challenges that they are facing in this transition that is happening in remote communities, to get a little bit closer to the challenges that are experiencing and what part of this research and what solutions that we're providing actually resonates with utilities. So we'll be doing that in Whitehorse. Next slide, please, Emily. And finally, as I mentioned, this research that we're presenting today is part of a much broader initiative, started back a year and a bit ago with some policy pieces that we published. This public webinar that we're doing before the conference, we will be presenting the same information at the conference. Part of what we're going to hear at the conference in the utility engagement session will be included in the conference summary and kind of actions for next steps around utility policy and regulations that we're calling kind of the pre-engagement phase, connecting with utilities, understanding their challenges, seeing what resonates, and then early engagement, this next piece, through the summer. Further work, our goals is to establish a utility working group to really work towards and support utilities in this process. We're connected and collaborating with the ICE Network, the 2020 Catalyst Program, to dig into this further in one of their on-sites as part of their 2020 Catalyst Program that's happening in Iqaluit, I believe. Further research and action needed. What we're going to present is pretty detailed, dense research, but there's a lot more to understand and do when it comes to regulatory and policy design. And all of this is encompassed in a campaign that we started in the fall called the FAIR campaign, Fair and Inclusive Rates, which is advocating for more effective and fair rates through IPP policies. And that can only be really accomplished through utility reform. So making the connection between what is required for utilities to be able to support Indigenous communities wanting to develop their own energy, and how do we look at supporting better rates for those projects. And this is all critically important to Pembina and the work that we do around policy and regulatory reform, understanding that utilities are in this transition of clean energy adoption in remote communities. Change is happening and utilities need to be part of the solution. So looking to support utilities as well as Indigenous communities on what that collaboration looks like, what tools and research and understanding that utilities need to understand in order to address some of the challenges that they're facing, but also support Indigenous-led clean energy projects. So this today presentation is part of a much broader initiative in years to come. I think that is all I will say on that. I'm going to pass it over to Emily to get into the details.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Just a note for anyone joining us in Whitehorse for Renewables in Remote Communities Conference. Today's presentation will be the same as the one presented on the pre-conference day. So if you're going to be in Whitehorse, no need to attend both, or feel free to attend both and continue the discussions there as well. So today we'll be exploring findings from our most recent research report, Transforming the Utility Business Model, starting off with an overview of the current state and government, regulator, and utility roles and responsibilities as they pertain to utility operations. Moving on, we'll go into an intro as to why utility business model reform is needed, and an overview of the reform options identified in our research as they pertain to the remote community context. Like I said, the last 30 minutes will be left for questions. I wanted to start today's presentation with a quick poll to see everyone's level of familiarity with utility reform. So you should shortly see a poll appear on your screen. Based off of the preliminary survey that we put out, the audience seems to be majority utilities and government, which I'm glad to see, a few private sector as well. And utility reform is really a fairly new topic in Canada and specifically for remote communities. So, we're hoping to press these conversations more and make sure everyone in the audience is checking off the later have explored it for remote communities box after this presentation.
And while the polls are coming in, also want to say from the list of registrations for the webinar, we had over 87 registered, which was awesome to see. Great to see representation from the federal government, Alberta government, Nunavut territory, and the Northwest Territories as well. We have about 6 utilities joining us hopefully today, several Indigenous communities, lots of nonprofits, academics, and the renewable energy sector as well. So great to see such great representation from the different stakeholders.
And it seems like the majority of people have participated. So sharing results. Seems like the audience is somewhat familiar or is pretty new to utility reform. So this presentation should be a good introduction into the nooks and crannies, but the report that Dave and I authored goes into much more detail on the reform options. So I encourage you to take a look, at least at the executive summary, at some of the recommendations targeted towards regulators, government, and utility respectively. Okay. So let's first discuss the evolving and current roles of government, regulators, and utilities. Utility reform is driven and influenced by governments, regulators, also known as utility commissions or utility boards, and utilities themselves. Understanding the current and evolving roles of each party is crucial to identifying the levers that can be used to drive and implement utility reform. The specific roles of each of these entities will vary based on your jurisdiction, but I've highlighted here what I think are the most important roles as they pertain to utility reform. So for governments, that's writing acts and regulations. For regulators, that's approving utility investments and electricity rates. And for utilities, that's applying safe and reliable power at a reasonable cost. To understand why utility business models need to change, it needs to be understood that utility responsibilities are changing, and that utilities cannot meet these new responsibilities under their current business model. As shown in the figure on the screen, utilities are no longer expected to just provide a safe, reliable, and affordable energy system. Because of shifts in policy and societal goals, utilities are now facing new responsibilities around climate change, reconciliation and Indigenous rights, and increasing innovation and improving customer satisfaction within the energy sector. These new responsibilities mean that utility roles need to evolve and that utilities need new ways to earn revenue outside of just selling electricity such that they can meet these new responsibilities. Emerging responsibilities aren't just isolated to utilities though. Governments and regulators also need to be adapting to meet climate change, reconciliation, and customer priorities. For governments, these new roles include setting targets and policies to achieve these targets, and directing specific actors, whether that be the regulator or sometimes the utility through special directives to achieve those climate targets, and aligning actions of all parties with Indigenous rights and relationships such as reconciliation and labor. Regulators need to be continuing to ensure customer protection as these changes are taking place. They also need to ensure that utility long-term planning reflects climate policy. Utilities need to be planning for more renewable energy, energy efficiency, and increased electrification if climate targets are to be met. Like I mentioned on the last slide, utilities need to be addressing all of their new responsibilities. I also wanted to highlight that although utility business models are currently not conducive to utilities being able to support these new responsibilities, some utilities are regardless starting to develop their own climate action plans and targets. This demonstrates that utilities can still be proactive, although somewhat limited in their current responsibilities. Addressing these new responsibilities and implementing utility reform is not without its challenges, and these challenges will be present for any utility implementing reform, but they're particularly significant for utilities servicing remote communities because of the additional technical, financial, and capacity barriers faced. Starting off with the 4 technical challenges that we identified in our research, the first is that maintaining energy reliability and security is already a challenge for utilities serving remote community microgrids, meaning that utilities are incurring higher operational costs and risks. Balancing these microgrids will become increasingly more difficult as more renewable energy is integrated into the system. Being isolated from larger grids also mean that they need to maintain a supply redundancy, meaning that even as more renewable energy is integrated into the grid, existing diesel generators will oftentimes need to remain online, and new business models need to account for these operational costs. The remoteness of these communities also mean that it's generally financially unfeasible to connect them to larger territorial and provincial grids. This restricts the implementation of business models that require access to wholesale markets. The telecommunications infrastructure in remote communities is also generally insufficient to support some of the advanced control systems needed by some business models. This means that if these business models are to be implemented, upgrades will be needed. Moving on to the 5 identified financial and capacity barriers. Both the high cost of operating in these communities and the limited access to these communities mean that implementing new business models is a logistical challenge. These high operating costs translate into some of the highest electricity rates in the country. So any changes to utility revenue need to be very carefully considered to ensure that no negative unintended consequences are passed on to customers. Subsidies are widely used in remote communities to make these high costs somewhat more manageable. However, they also make evaluating the financial impacts of new business models more complex. Any changes to utility revenues are going to be absorbed by a smaller group of customers in remote communities, making the impacts more significant and making the significance of carefully evaluating these impacts that much more important. Finally, utilities operating in remote communities generally have limited internal capacity for exploring and implementing new business models. This means that external support is needed if new business models are to be implemented and if utility business model reform is to progress. Now that we have an understanding of the roles and responsibilities of government, regulators, and utilities, and the challenges that utilities face in operating in these communities, we can start to explore what business model reform could look like in the remote community context. Some key terms to understand are what is a utility business model and what is utility reform. Utility business models, as shown on the screen, dictate how utilities generate revenue and profit. They influence utility priorities and actions. So when I mention utility business models, this encompasses what drives utilities in their decision-making to meet their bottom line and their responsibilities. Utility reform changes the way that utilities make money by introducing new revenue opportunities and charge customers, moving away from just fixed and variable fees or shifting how much of a monthly bill is proportionally comprised of the fixed and variable charges. What's key to take away from this presentation is that utility reform is necessary to unlock partnership opportunities and make utilities more receptive of clean energy projects. A full and accelerated clean energy transition in remote communities will not be possible without reforming the ways that utilities operate. I've alluded to the restrictions put into place by the current business model, but I've yet to explain what this business model actually is, also known as the cost of service model. The balance between actual revenues and the revenue requirement is what sets the foundation for the cost of service business model. The revenue requirement is the amount of income that utilities need to earn in order to cover their costs. Rates are then set based off of this revenue requirement and the expected amount of energy that they expect to sell. What this means is that determining what the revenue requirement is and what's factored into the revenue requirement is extremely crucial for determining electricity rates and actual utility earnings. What this also means is that a change in electricity sales, as may result from an increase in energy efficiency or renewable energy projects, will impact whether or not utilities can cover their costs. This is part of what disincentivizes utilities from promoting renewable energy and energy efficiency under the cost of service model. Like I mentioned, what's factored into the revenue requirement is crucial for determining utility priorities because the revenue requirement establishes how much income the utilities are actually able to collect. Just to note that whenever I say that utilities can or cannot undertake certain actions, this is a direct result of current regulations. that lock utility and regulator priorities into the cost of service model. Breaking down what's factored into the revenue requirement, we have operating costs, amortized capital costs, and profit. Under the cost of service model, capital costs are directly tied to utility-owned infrastructure. So any customer-owned infrastructure, such as customer-owned renewables, are not factored into the revenue requirement and hence do not translate to utility revenues. Profit under the cost of service model is directly correlated to the total value of utility infrastructure. Just to note that the majority of utilities operating in remote communities are not for profit, but for those that operate in for-profit environments, this is a crucial consideration to what drives their motives. As shown in the figure on the screen, what this means is that for utilities, owning more capital-intensive assets means higher overall revenue. In summary, the relationship between revenue requirement, capital costs, and profit mean that utilities are disincentivized to allow or promote customers to own their own energy infrastructure. This is contrary to the clean energy projects that are needed to meet policy goals and is a barrier to Indigenous entrepreneurs and communities moving towards their energy sovereignty. Lastly, I wanted to highlight that under the cost of service model, profits are only a function of capital costs and not operating costs. This creates an incentive for utilities to choose capital solutions over operating ones when addressing the need. This may not be the most optimal solution and is also a barrier to third parties wanting to enter the energy market. Let's take a look at what the cost of service model means for clean energy projects more specifically. Under the cost of service model, if you generate your own energy, as would be the case, for example, if you're installing a rooftop solar system and that energy is being fed directly into your home, you're buying less energy from the utility, so their sales go down. The cost of service model creates a conflict of interest between utilities and the clean energy transition. This can potentially have severe negative consequences if not proactively addressed. As shown in the figure on the right of the screen, if customers increase their energy efficiency and renewable energy adoption, demand will increase, meaning that actual revenue will now be lower than the revenue requirement. In response to this, utilities will need to raise rates in order to meet their revenue requirement, increasing customer bills. Customers are more likely to further increase their energy efficiency and renewable energy adoption in response to these higher bills to reduce their demand, perpetuating what's known as the utility death spiral. Although this is a worst case scenario, it does show very plainly what the consequences of inaction are. As the clean energy transition accelerates and communities advance their energy sovereignty, utilities will need to respond to this increased uptake of renewable energy and energy efficiency in order to address this. To summarize the limitations of the cost of service model, it discourages renewable energy and energy efficiency due to the conflict of interest it creates between utilities and the clean energy transition. It limits utility revenue and profit opportunities as utility profits are dependent on the value of their physical assets. And utilities don't earn a profit on operating costs, such as power purchase agreements and net metering expenses. It also incentivizes utilities to sell more energy, which is contrary to the demand reductions needed to reduce our environmental impacts. The cost of service model, as I mentioned, puts an incentive for capital investments over operational changes, limiting third-party entry to the energy market. The restrictive rate-making process of current regulations also limits innovation from the utility end if utilities want to explore new ways of earning revenue. All in all, these factors limit Indigenous participation and independence within the energy sector, a major concern for remote communities. So utility business model reform is needed to address all of these limitations. It should be acknowledged that as governments set increasingly ambitious climate targets, utilities are really the gateway for these projects. Utilities need to be planning for more renewable energy and energy efficiency on the grid. And without the support of utilities, meeting these climate targets will be even more of a challenge than it already is. However, under the cost of service model, like I mentioned, utilities are often not as supportive of renewable energy and of energy efficiency projects because doing so will lower their revenue and force them to raise rates. The cost of service model means that clean energy projects threaten utility bottom lines. So reform is needed such that utilities can earn revenue from new sources, and utility revenue is no longer just based off of the quantity of energy sold. This will allow utilities to be active partners and supporters of clean energy projects. Looking at emerging responsibilities more specifically, although providing safe, reliable power at an affordable cost is still a priority, utilities also need to be considering climate change and reconciliation. The cost of service model's emphasis on energy sales limits utilities from advancing new initiatives to address these emerging responsibilities. That's why utility business model reform needs to be carefully evaluated between governments, regulators, and utilities alike. Now that we've established a baseline understanding of current utility operations and the barriers to the clean energy transition put into place by the cost of service model, we can start to explore options for reform to address these barriers. To address new utility responsibilities and the limitations of the cost of service model, we identified 6 objectives for reform. These were used in selecting the business models evaluated in our research. First, we identified that aligning utility operations with climate policy objectives is of paramount importance. Utilities also need to be supporting renewable energy and energy efficiency project implementation. This means that utilities will need to remove their incentive to grow energy sales and instead support demand reduction. Supporting Indigenous rights and reconciliation is also crucial for utilities operating in remote communities. As clean energy projects increase, utilities, third parties, and customers need to be sharing their business and investment risks rather than one party bearing adoption risks that may be associated with renewable energy or energy efficiency. Utilities also need to continue to minimize spending to ensure that energy is provided at lowest cost. To meet these reform objectives, utilities can restructure their electricity bills and/or generate new revenue opportunities met by government funding for utilities to meet policy objectives, changing what's factored into rates, and direct payments for non-utility companies for utility services. In this research, we identified 4 options for reform to address these 6 reform objectives. As shown in the table on the screen, we chose to evaluate performance incentive mechanisms, revenue decoupling, tow tax, and platform service revenues. Each of these reform options has a varying degree of effectiveness at meeting the reform objectives, where 3 checkmarks shows that it is very effective and no checkmarks means that it does not meet this reform objective. The table also distinguishes between the pathway for change used by each reform option, whether that's by changing how rates are structured, establishing new revenue streams, or both. The 4 reform options will be explored in more detail in the subsequent slides. The report that Dave and I authored goes into more detail into the intricacies of each mechanism, best practices for implementation, and considerations for utilities servicing remote communities, acknowledging the barriers and unique circumstances that I mentioned earlier. Starting off with performance incentive mechanisms, or PIMs, where regulators identify areas that utilities should prioritize, such as increasing energy efficiency or reducing emissions from generation. Regulators then ensure that performance in those areas is improved by tracking utility performance, although this does add complexity for implementation. If performance exceeds the baseline amount established by the regulator to represent business as usual operations, utilities are rewarded either through direct payments by government or an increase in allowable profit margins. How PIMs impact utility revenue is shown at the bottom of the slide. As shown, revenue is no longer just based off of operating and capital costs, but it's also tied to utility performance. PIMs have some major advantages rooted in their flexibility to target regulator-identified goals. These advantages include aligning utility operations with climate and reconciliation policy goals depending on what PIMs are implemented, motivating utility spending towards programs that were otherwise not financially incentivized, and increasing information available to regulators and other stakeholders from PIM tracking and reporting. However, PIMs also have disadvantages and limitations that must be addressed to ensure that implementation avoids unnecessary burdens on customers and PIM administrators. This slide shows the disadvantages of PIMs on the left, while the methods of addressing these disadvantages is shown on the right. This format is carried through for the other reform options. Starting off with the disadvantages, PIMs are fairly complicated for regulators and utilities to establish and operate due to the reporting and validation requirements. These requirements mean that PIMs require significant additional capacity support from the utility and the regulator. Performance setting in itself is also difficult. Establishing the baseline to represent business as usual operations is extremely important, as minor changes in this baseline can have large impacts on utility revenue. Performance should only award non-business as usual and exemplary actions from the utility, although performance setting baselines should be high enough to ensure that utilities are promoted to undertake new actions to meet these goals. To address these disadvantages, governments need to be appropriately funding regulators such that they can design these programs. And utilities and regulators need to have adequate resources and capacity to address these increased program requirements. In order to ensure that performance setting targets are adequately set, pilot projects are necessary to test these baselines. Moving on to revenue decoupling, where decoupling can be implemented to address utility barriers to energy efficiency. Recall that the disincentive towards energy efficiency is rooted in utilities protecting their revenues, as more energy efficiency reduces sales and hence reduces revenue under predetermined rates. Contrary to cost of service, under decoupling, rates are regularly adjusted to reflect actual sales volumes. The revenue requirement can also be adjusted more regularly to reflect actual spending, although this is not always done. Essentially, revenue decoupling balances actual costs and sales with actual costs. The primary advantage of decoupling is that it removes utility incentives to grow sales. Specifically, it removes utility hesitancy to support renewable energy and energy efficiency projects that would have reduced their revenue under the cost of service model. It also reduces utility revenue loss risk to better align business practices away from growing sales and towards renewable energy and energy efficiency. It's clear that revenue decoupling addresses utility apprehension towards energy efficiency, but it's also clear that there's potential for rate increases under revenue decoupling. What's important to remember is that rate increases do not necessarily result in cost increases if implemented with the right programs and if properly designed. The first method of mitigating price increases is to cap rate increases. This cap should be carefully chosen with the expected amount of energy efficiency uptake in mind. If set too high or too low, the impacts of decoupling could be dampened. Caps should also mitigate rate increases that are not directly attributable to clean energy adoption. To mitigate shifting energy sales risk to customers, energy bill burdens as a whole should be reduced by increasing the availability of energy efficiency programs, initiatives, and funding. It's crucial that these energy efficiency programs are available across customer groups to ensure that fairness and cost shifting concerns are mitigated. While revenue decoupling removes utility disincentives towards energy efficiency, it also doesn't provide a specific direct incentive for utilities to promote the adoption of energy efficiency, renewable energy, or specifically independent power producer projects. As such, energy efficiency resource standards and renewable portfolio standards should be put into place. Energy efficiency resource standards set specific long-term energy saving targets for utilities. Renewable portfolio standards require utilities to generate a specific amount of renewable energy. RPSs should specifically require utilities to procure a set amount of renewable energy rather than exclusively operate self-generation to present opportunities for Indigenous communities and entrepreneurs to enter the energy market. These policies can be seen as overly top-down methods, but are ultimately, they help facilitate utility reform, specifically by supporting some of the information collection needs. In their implementation, it needs to be ensured that communities and Indigenous entrepreneurs have adequate opportunities and that funding reflects the standards put into place. Decoupling is also not effective at addressing some other objectives for utility reform, such as incentives for capital investments and efficient spending. This demonstrates the need to implement other reform options in tandem to address these shortfalls. Moving on to the total expenditure approach, or TOTEX. As I noted earlier, under cost of service, utilities do not earn a return on operating costs. This is addressed with TOTEX, which opens a door for utilities to choose non-capital alternatives to addressing operational needs. With TOTEX, as shown in the figure in the bottom of the slide, profit is a function of both capital and operating costs. Beyond incentivizing utilities to evaluate operating costs and capital expenses under the same light, in the context of the energy transition in remote communities, a primary advantage of TOTEX is that it allows utilities to earn a return on independent power producer contracts, creating opportunities for Indigenous companies and communities to develop renewable energy projects. TOTEX is fairly new, and it hasn't been applied widely in other jurisdictions. Because of this, early adoption should be done by utilities that serve predominantly grid-tied customers, as they are going to be less impacted by potentially unforeseen consequences compared to utilities that service smaller grid-tied or non-grid-tied customers. To accurately assess whether to make capital or operating changes, utilities will need to increase their data availability. To do this, utilities may need to update their infrastructure for data collection and contract third parties for software needs. Finally, let's discuss platform service revenues. Platform service revenues are a way for utilities to serve as a broker between utility customers and energy companies. Utilities coordinate the services of these companies into the grid and provide companies with direct access to their customers in exchange for a fee that the energy company pays the utility, giving the utility a new revenue stream. This is a best case scenario for utilities, third parties, and customers, as utilities have new revenue streams, barriers to entry are lowered for third parties, and customers get expanded services. As I mentioned, this is a win-win-win scenario. Platform service revenues also align utility operations with climate and reconciliation goals by allowing for an increase in innovation in the energy sector to reduce emissions and by allowing greater access to the energy sector for Indigenous entrepreneurs. Platform service revenues are a great opportunity for the energy sector in remote communities. However, the effectiveness of this reform action may be lessened if the uptake of third-party services is not very high due to the relatively small customer base. That being said, platform service revenues still provide positive impacts even if they're somewhat limited. This also demonstrates the importance to ensure that customers are aware of the offerings of these third-party energy service companies to increase uptake and ensure that customers are allotted the full benefits of their implementation. Like with TOTEX, platform service revenues are less widely adopted than PIMs and decoupling. And similarly, early adoption should be done by utilities who are less risk adverse. So it should also be noted that there is a possibility for higher overall costs in offering these services because of the introduction of platform fees. However, the economic opportunity allotted to third parties addresses this disadvantage, and customers can mitigate any higher costs through the new energy efficiency and management service offerings. Which of the 4 options are implemented will depend on the specific goals of your jurisdiction and the priorities for reform. From the figure, you can see that no one option addresses all of these 6 objectives for reform. Options may have to be implemented in tandem to achieve the desired outcome. Some reform options, like decoupling, require others to be implemented at the same time to address shortfalls. When choosing options for reform, jurisdictions should be aware of the objectives for reform and how each reform option interacts with one another. Reform can't occur through the actions of any one party independently. Because of the interconnected nature of utility operations, where government dictates on a high level utility priorities and regulator priorities, and regulators approve or deny utility applications, utility reform requires coordinated action from all three parties of government, regulator, and utility. For remote communities in particular, reform should also be driven and informed by the Indigenous communities that these utilities operate in, ensuring alignment with the actions and priorities of the communities. Due to the extensive need for utility reform, working groups will need to be established to coordinate actions between all of these parties. In this research, we identified 8 steps that a working group could undertake to implement utility reform. The first is to identify and categorize new responsibilities for utilities into those groups of climate change, reconciliation, and Indigenous rights, and innovation and customer satisfaction within the energy sector. Next is to prioritize these responsibilities in accordance to the goals for utility reform. The working group also needs to identify challenges to meeting these new responsibilities under the cost of service model and under current regulations. Next, the working group should determine which reform objectives to target for that jurisdiction of the 6 reform objectives discussed earlier in the presentation. Next is to determine the reform options to best satisfy the selected objectives, considering the pros and cons of each reform option. To tie in step 3, the working group should then revisit the main challenges identified to ensure that the selected reform options address these challenges. This is perhaps the most important step, and that's to map out what utility reform would look like in your jurisdiction. Determine which option to explore first, study the impacts on rates and revenues, conduct pilot projects, and evaluate how to best implement reform and whether it should be done in one or multiple stages. Identify actions required between each of the working group members, including governments, regulators, and utilities, to implement the utility reform action. Finally, coordinate next steps amongst working group members and stakeholders. This figure demonstrates what a hypothetical future state could look like for utilities in remote communities, where revenue is no longer strictly dependent on just selling units of energy under the cost of service model. These new and diversified revenue streams result in utilities having more opportunities to support the clean energy transition. The clean energy transition is a multi-step process, and utility reform is just one of those steps. This figure, adapted from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, shows how utility reform fits into the broader steps of the transition. As shown, advancing clean energy projects, at least at the speed and scale needed to meet climate commitments, requires utility reform as a necessary first step. Okay, I think we're now going to move on to questions. Hopefully I didn't go too fast.
I am just trying to come back here. Great. Okay, thank you, Emily, for walking us through that. For those of you that have looked at the report, you know, it's 100+ pages of pretty detailed information. You know, a lot of the research that we took was from other research reports that have looked at grid-tied utility reform. So acknowledge that there is a lot to absorb here. Again, this is just a starting point of research and a conversation and engagement with all stakeholders that are interested in this. Before we go to questions, and also realize that, you know, questions through typing questions in this type of webinar is probably not the best format. This is more of a conversation and engagement with utilities and governments and regulators. So that's what we have right now, is to try and answer any specific questions you have through the Q&A box. Before we get to that, I want to acknowledge Grace Brown, who was another one of the researchers on this research piece. We tried to have this utility webinar before she went off on mat leave. She was not able, or we were not able to get it out in time. So just wanted to acknowledge Grace's work on this as well. And again, this is a presentation to download, to share information on the research that we've done. Again, in Whitehorse next week, we will be doing the same presentation for any of you that want to come to this again. Any colleagues that you know are going to the conference that you think would be interested in this topic. It is from 4 to 5:30 on Monday, April 25th at the Quinlan Dunn Cultural Center. So we'll basically be going through the same thing. And then this utility engagement session, we've decided to primarily focus on sitting down with utilities. Again, the diagram that Emily went through, acknowledging that there's governments, there's regulators and utilities, three very important stakeholders, as well as Indigenous communities and businesses that want to develop renewable energy projects or implement energy efficiency projects. But we're starting with utilities. From our perspective and how change happens, we really need to have utilities on board, and the utilities need to understand pathways for change and what is possible. And that's where some of this change will come from. Absolutely, we need to engage more with Indigenous communities and ensure that this transition that could happen in different utility business model reforms, are taken into account, and around energy prices and the cost of energy in remote communities. So that, Indigenous communities, businesses are an extremely important stakeholder that has to be involved, as well as regulators and governments. But we're going to start with utilities because there's a lot to share, there's a lot to discuss. But that session is the goal for what we're going to do with that utility engagement session, and that is happening Thursday, April 25th from 1 to 2. We have sent out an invite to utilities. There are a few exceptions for other stakeholders that we have invited to that session. But that again is primarily for utilities to basically roll up our sleeves and look at some of this research in a little bit more detail. Okay, we will go to questions. We have one right now, and whether you have a question or even just a general comment, would love to get a sense of, is this useful? Is this kind of hitting the mark with the challenges that you're facing either as a utility or government around, how to direct utilities around this topic, how to encourage more Indigenous leadership and ownership of energy systems in remotes. So happy to take feedback, not just questions, but again, realizing that this is more of a dynamic conversation back and forth, and writing questions down on text is difficult. So I will go to the first one from Lucy, and the question is, can you comment on whether some of these options are already implemented and to what scale or extent?
Yeah, definitely. So we go into this in more detail in the report, but all of the options identified have been implemented in other markets. Most significantly is PIMs, or platform or performance incentive mechanisms, maybe because they are very effective at addressing a broad range of utility and government priorities. So they've been implemented in Ontario, New York, the UK, and Hawaii, among many other states. Decoupling has also been implemented in Ontario and the UK. And like I mentioned, tow tax and platform service revenues are the newest options that are being evaluated and have only been implemented in a few select markets. So of the ones that we looked at, that's isolated to just the UK and New York. I wanted to note as well, in terms of drawing parallels between these grid-tied markets where reform has been implemented and remote communities in Canada, is maybe the most similar would be Hawaii, given that they are also operating using diesel generators, and they have the highest costs, or some of the highest costs, of supplying electricity in the US. And they just implemented PIMs, their performance incentive mechanisms, in 2021. So the long-term impacts and hopefully positive outcomes to drive the clean energy transition from PIM implementation have kind of yet to materialize. But a major driving force for that implementation was the proliferation of customers wanting to increase rooftop solar adoption, increase their own energy system ownership. And that's kind of a similar trend as we're seeing in remote communities as well.
Great, thanks, Emily. And there is a chapter in the report that describes this a little bit more detail, some of the jurisdictional review that we did do. A few comments on the chat box. Definitely, we will share both the presentation in PDF form, and I believe, yes, this webinar is being recorded, and I believe we will host or put the webinar up on either Pemina's YouTube channel or some other way on our website. So we'll definitely get that out. Erica, thanks for the notion and offer to pass this on to Quest's utility partners. Absolutely, share this broadly and widely. The more we get this information out there and get utilities to understand that there are some opportunities for change, the better. So absolutely, please do pass on. Next question from John Parkins. What are the implications for utility reform within jurisdictions and utilities that provide 100% green energy versus those that do not? Emily,
I think that there is perhaps a larger push from government and from other entities wanting to see a greener grid for utility reform in jurisdictions that still rely heavily on fossil fuels. And I mean, for the majority of remote communities, diesel generation is the most, by far, prevalent source of generation, so that push is there. However, allowing for the clean energy transition, allowing for more renewable energy and energy efficiency is only one aspect of utility reform. For remote communities especially, another major aspect is allowing greater opportunities for Indigenous communities and entrepreneurs to access the energy system and participate fully to be able to benefit from the benefits of the clean energy transition, which is not really possible under the current business model. So even for grids that are already fairly green, already based mostly on hydropower, there's still that motivation to allowing third-party access to the energy market within remote communities.
Thanks, Emily. Question from Jeff Knapp. Hi, Jeff. Have you tested the receptivity of utilities to this idea yet? So I'll provide some quick thoughts, and then Emily, if you want to add something more. Not specifically, that's the point of step one, do this research, get it out, share it, educate. That's what we're going to do in Whitehorse is sit down with utilities. So I haven't tested the receptivity of utilities wanting to explore utility business model, but we absolutely, through the work that we do, the policy work that we do broadly, and through the Indigenous Off-Diesel Initiative, we know utilities are having these challenges, loss of revenue from Indigenous renewable energy projects and energy efficiency. We know utilities are experiencing these challenges, are looking for solutions, know that it's going to keep happening, more and more. So I draw the assumption that utilities are needing some solutions to deal with the Indigenous transition in clean energy that is happening in remote communities. Emily, anything to add on that one?
Just from the survey that we put out to participants, it was evident that utilities are already starting to experience some of the challenges of supporting the clean energy transition on their end. So it needs to be recognized that If these challenges are present, utilities need new opportunities and new revenue streams so that they can be fully supportive of the clean energy transition and supportive of these Indigenous communities wanting to progress their energy projects.
And what we're laying out here is yes, it's within the context of remote communities, but we know, this is utility business model reform, and climate goals and ambitions from governments is what utilities are experiencing in grid-tied jurisdictions as well, and that's where we've drawn a lot of the research from. Out here in BC, it's a really interesting example of, this is happening as well. There's BC climate goals and targets, and BC Hydro looking at how to deal with those climate targets. And specifically in BC, there's also a nice connection to where I live. 10 kilometers down the road is Cheyenne First Nation, also known as Beecher Bay, which is where the first pulse for what is now Indigenous utility regulation inquiry in BC, looking at how utilities can actually, or how Indigenous communities can actually become utilities and regulated differently under the BCUC. So there's another interesting thread here of not just supporting Crown utilities and private utilities on how to adapt and change in the clean energy transition, but there's also this thread of supporting Indigenous communities to actually become their own utilities and provide energy to their own communities. So there's lots happening in this space, and lots of different ways that some of these challenges can be solved. Question from Michelle. Trying to understand the revenue model. You said profit is only a function of capital cost, but isn't transmission and distribution part of operating costs?
From what I understand, transmission and distribution infrastructure is still encompassed in capital costs. So whenever I say capital costs, there's just the value of any physical infrastructure that utilities are responsible for. It also depends on the jurisdiction of the utility, whether they're vertically integrated, as many remote community utilities are, or if they are just responsible for a portion of the overall energy system, such as, if they just handle generation, another utility handles transmission and distribution, in which case some of these costs may not be actualized as capital on their balance sheet. But essentially, yeah, any physical infrastructure that utility owns is what's included in capital costs, and that's what profit is a function of under the cost of service model.
Next question from Erica. Did you analyze costs to governments from jurisdictions which have done so to fund regulators to work on designing PIMs?
One thing is that, well, these balance sheets are not always widely available, but also remote communities in Canada are fairly unique in that the majority of these utilities are public, not for profit. So that in this situation, PIMs would need to be supported by government funding rather than increasing allowable profit margins, because there isn't a profit margin to increase. But in other jurisdictions that we analyzed, these are mostly private utilities. So instead of government top-ups and payments to supplement revenue to support PIMs, a lot of these jurisdictions have adopted an increase or decrease to allowable profit margins. So the exact mechanisms in which costs and government and revenue correlate are going to vary depending on whether a utility is private and public. And because the majority of utilities that have implemented this in other jurisdictions in the States and in Europe are private, the interactions are going to be pretty different than in the remote community context.
Next question from Ryan regarding lower energy sales due to renewables and the cost of service model. What disadvantages exist with what seems to be the current standard model of utility utility purchasing power from communities through power purchase agreements, as it seems to work with the current cost of service model?
There's a couple things ingrained there. One being that utilities are then left with looking at their current diesel generation. If they're looking at buying power to replace existing diesel generation and transition off diesel, utilities still need some avenue to recover those costs and retire those assets, which is not really allowable, or is not really easy to do under the cost of service model. That's one aspect of things. Another thing is for profit generating utilities, that these power purchase agreements are operating costs that would just be passed through to consumers through electricity rates, and they're not allowed to earn a profit over these costs. So it kind of creates a disincentive for utilities to choose the power purchase agreement over continuing to operate their capital infrastructure that they can earn a profit on.
Okay, and I'll jump to the chat window. A question from Kevin Mann, saying that some of the challenges as a utility. I got to scroll here. Some of the challenges as a utility in remote communities are highlighted. So one of the beginning slides that we provided, where we really focused on the challenges of utilities. And the question from Kevin is the same challenge exercise going to be more fully explored from both the Indigenous and regulator point of view?
I think that is really a major task that the future working group should be undertaking, because that requires some, I think, more intensive discussion between each of the parties to identify those challenges, whereas those utility challenges for operating a microgrid, I think, are more widely apparent, whereas challenges for Indigenous communities specifically, I think, need to come from these community members as they actively participate in utility reform. So I think that, yes, that's a crucial step to identifying future objectives and actions as utility reform progresses, but it really needs to stem from, for Indigenous communities especially, the entities themselves.
Yeah, and I would echo that as well. Like, absolutely, there's challenges with all the stakeholders. I think we have a fairly good understanding of some of them, but again, for this research, we wanted to start with really understanding the utility space and really understanding, how utilities operate, their cost of service model, and the challenges that they're facing real time. So, this is a multiple dimensional solution of utilities, regulators, governments, and then Indigenous communities and entrepreneurs and businesses that actually want to provide power. Right now that avenue is mostly through utilities, but larger goals, providing power autonomously through different regulatory avenues to their communities and their community members themselves. Okay, well, that is most of the questions. Just a follow-up from Jeff. We might have one more coming in here. I know it's just past lunchtime in Eastern time, so we absolutely definitely do not have to go to the half hour. Hopefully this was a helpful dip into this material and the research that we've been doing over the past year. Again, this is just a starting point of the discussion. Eager to actually sit down and have conversations with all of you that are going to Whitehorse next week. So we'll probably wrap it up with this one last question. For those of you that do have to jump off, and I'm seeing a few now, thank you very much for joining and participating and being interested in this topic. It's a very fundamental challenge that Indigenous communities are facing with wanting to develop more clean energy systems. Question from Sumeda: is there currently a restriction on which consumers can install renewable energy sources at their premise, because renewable energy integration is definitely a technical problem for the grid?
It does depend on the jurisdiction. The current regulations put into place either through acts or through the utilities terms and conditions of service themselves. But the short answer is that in some jurisdictions there is more wiggle room, but ultimately the utility often does have power. It's pretty standard in the terms and conditions to say that they have authority to restrict supplying power to you if there's not an agreement reached for whether or not you can generate your own energy. So it does vary on the jurisdiction, but that's one of the sources of conflict, is that customers are wanting to implement their own renewable energy, and that's not always allowable either by the utility or by current regulations, or both.
Yeah, there's regulation and regulatory restrictions that utilities are using to limit and slow that adoption and that implementation of renewable energy projects. We've heard lots of experiences on that, but then there's also policies. Right now, under the policy and regulatory framework, most Indigenous communities that want to generate their own energy have to go through a formalized or informal process around an independent power policy that dictates the terms and conditions and the rates that they receive for the energy that they do sell to the utility. So the utility is fundamentally still in control of those decisions. There has been some governments that have put forth IPP policies that direct utilities to support independent power production. So there's both policy and regulatory barriers that really do limit which consumers can install renewable energy, whether it's on buildings or as part of a larger utility scale project. That's the last question. It looks like one more might be being typed. Nope, that's it. Okay, well, we will wrap it up. Again, thank you all for participating and taking time out of everyone's busy schedule. And for those of you that are making the trek up to Whitehorse to participate in the conference, we'll super excited to see you there. Again, take care, stay safe, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.